we'll try and start now. If almost everybody's here. I just say that our Greek friend hasn't turned up yet, but hopefully he'll come while the other speakers are starting, because if we wait, we may be waiting a long time, so we'll just continue on. My name is Patricia McKenna. I'm from Ireland. I'm also a member of the People's Movement and of Team Europe. This session here, hopefully we'll have 4 speakers. The first will be Phiilp Foster from the Campaign for an Independent Britain, then Kevin McCarthy from the People's Movement in Ireland, and hopefully our Greek friend arrives, and then Louise Helmer from Denmark. Now, I think this is very important, because as we know, we're having a referendum in the UK, which I think will be of fundamental importance, and as most people even recognise this morning, if we are lucky enough and we get the British people to vote to exit the EU, it is going to change the whole situation dramatically. It will give people hope that there is another alternative, that we're not locked into this undemocratic and unaccountable structure that we had no role to play in relation to its construction, that we're not locked into it forever, that there are other ways. But I think we'll also have to be very aware of the fact that huge obstacles are going to be put in front of those campaigning for exit. And as we know from our own experience in Ireland, we've had countless referendums on EU treaties, and we have had huge pressure put on us to vote the way the EU establishment wanted us to do, and sometimes when we actually didn't do what we were told to vote again and get it right. We gave them the wrong answer. Now, the other thing that you should be very aware of here is that there will be huge undemocratic interference from the EU institutions. We have seen this in the past. The Commission, the Council, the European Parliament, Europhile members, even the civil servants in the EU, they will all stick their nose into your referendum, despite the fact that you are the people who are voting. It is not their vote, but they will interfere, and they will justify it for all sorts of spurious grounds. We've seen it in Ireland. We saw the European Commission pour massive amounts of money into propaganda campaigns in Ireland. It was supposed to be information, yet the information was completely targeted at Ireland. So in other words, the Irish people seem to be the only ones deserving of EU information, while all the other countries wasn't getting the same attention. Anybody with an ounce of common sense would know that at that time, what they were doing when we were voting was interfering in our right to have a free and democratic vote without their interference. And you will get it. And already we've seen, as Kevin will be talking about later on, some of your elected representatives will be using all sorts of issues. And as I mentioned this morning about the border between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, everything will be put in your path to predict doom and gloom. And as Louise, I'm sure, will explain, in Denmark, anytime they had a vote, they were told if you don't vote to join the euro, for example, all hell will break loose. You will be an economic disaster. And they proved them wrong. And you can do that as well. So I better just continue now with our speakers. And I also would like to wish you well when the referendum, whenever it comes. But be prepared. Get ready now, because there will be no holds barred by the EU institutions and by your so-called political leaders as regards who they are leading. They're leading you to answer to somebody that's not even accountable to you. In other words, it's the EU institutions that are calling the shots, and the Europhiles who are deciding what this agenda is and what way you're supposed to vote. So just be aware of that. And I think you should challenge at every opportunity any interference by EU institutions. It's taxpayers' money, it's your money, it's not EU money, it's the money of the EU taxpayers. So we'll start first of all with Phiilp Foster from Campaign for an Independent Britain, and he's going to talk basically about the free market and what the free market is. Roughly 15 minutes per speaker, and I'll tip the thing when you have about a minute left, when you've got a minute to sum up.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that and that introduction, which I think is very remarkable, to think that people from Ireland are rooting for us, which, in view of our rather tragic history, is a very, very forgiving thing for you to do. Thank you.
You're most welcome.
Campaign for Independent Britain. I just got to flag up, do some advertising. We've got various booklets, leaflets on the table there, which you are free to take as many of. I don't want to take them home. There's one which is, in a sense, connected. It's something I republished, talking about EU propaganda. The Raspberry Ice Cream War came out in 1990-something. It was never distributed in England, though I believe it was in Ireland. It's meant for so-called teenagers. Well, I don't know what sort of teenagers they were expecting. It is toe-curlingly awful in terms of its propaganda. But the great message is the wonders and glories of open borders. The other two are one that Tony Coughlin contributed to, A House Divided, talking about our British Parliament and the European Parliament. We brought that out a few years ago. And Back on Children being misinformed in their schools, Generations Betrayed, an essay written by a top educational advisor as well as a headmaster in his time, which again is free. Help yourself. If you need more copies, get them from CIB. This is an advertising bit. This is good because I'm wasting all my time advertising. We've also got a little leaflet. It's quite useful. It is 5 mistaken assumptions of the EU referendum battle. Again, take it away and read it. If you need more copies, CIB can supply as many as you want with reasonable donations, he said. Well, I gave myself a title, Free Trade. What free trade? Because we're so talked about that the European Union is about free trade. I'm going to do a little bit of appalling history. Bear in mind that my main profession has been a Church of England minister. I'm now semi-retired. So I am not a great economist or businessman or anything like that, but I'm going to nonetheless summarise 1 or 2 thoughts. First of all, and it'll make some of the left perhaps wince, forgive me, I'm going to mention Adam Smith, a late 18th century gentleman who lived in Scotland, who wrote Wealth of Nations. And strangely, his basic thesis, though he probably didn't fully grasp this, because I don't know where he stood from a Christian perspective, was actually the parable of the talents that the Lord Jesus spoke about in the Gospel of Matthew. Remember, one servant was given 5, one was given 2, one was given 1. And they went out, and the 5 and the 2 traded and came back to their master. I've made 5 more, I've made 2 more. But one man buried it. Because he was frightened of his master. He said, I think, no, you were a dangerous man. I just buried it to keep it safe. And the man was very cross. He said, well, you could at least have put it in the banks and got interest. But he buried it. Lesson? Well, Jesus had a bigger lesson. But the lesson that one can draw from that economically is that money is not meant to be accumulated, but it's a means of creating work and so forth. That's what Adam Smith realised. In a sense, people knew it beforehand, but so often when you read a book like that, you think, why on earth didn't I think of that blindingly obvious point? Sometimes the clearest books are the ones that are blindingly obvious, and yet nobody's actually put it down. Anyway, that's sort of in a sense where I begin, because he was, if you like, the advocate for the free market. Because he also understood something about human nature. If you get human nature wrong, then your economics are likely to be a bit muddled as well. As he famously put it, and I quote, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard for their own interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our necessities, but of their advantages." That's his famous statement about the nature of exchange. And, in fact, strangely, it works on the whole. You, suppose, are rearing animals for meat, and I grow vegetables. Now, if we engage in straightforward trade, I can trade some of my vegetables for your animal, and you similarly can trade your animal for some of my vegetables. Answer? You don't just have to eat meat, and I don't just have to eat vegetables, but we both have meat and 2 veg, as we say in England, for lunch. The exchange is a mutual benefit. Okay, that's all, I won't say blindingly obvious. But the other point he made was that on the whole, markets should regulate themselves because of the nature of the laws that operate with human nature. Now, that doesn't always work brilliantly. But nonetheless, it works reasonably well, as long as companies don't become corporates. This seems to me to be the problem, if you like. In Adam Smith's day, this probably was not happening. Companies were simply not that big. He wasn't keen on joint stock companies, didn't think they were a good idea at all. But the idea of the corporate as opposed to the entrepreneur and the person who gets up and gets on and does things. He would say that free markets should be left on the whole to regulate themselves. But it only works if the free markets are dependent on something above and beyond that free market. And here I come back to my Christian perspective, which I'm going to briefly touch on here. It depends on law which comes from outside. The laws, I would say, like the Ten Commandments. You shall not steal. You shall not defraud. You shall not bear false witness. The laws of the Old Testament were full of very pragmatic laws about keeping honest scales. In other words, you don't short sell people. All that kind of thing was there. The free market works as long as, if you like, there is a sort of regulation, but it's not the kind that the EU are so keen on. It's the laws of God that keep us honest, because God knows what we're like. Left to our own devices, we will and tend towards getting dishonest. So that's a sort of a basis of why I want to talk about the free market as opposed to the so-called single market, which strangely is often interpreted as being the free market. Free markets allow, on the whole, the markets to regulate what happens by their own processes, because if we interfere, things often start to go wrong. Regulation of the kind that the European Union and those above the European Union in the World Trade Organization and so on pass down to us are something Adam Smith would have regarded with absolute horror. And indeed, he wrote about it, because that sort of corruption, that is manipulating the markets for the advantage of the big and the great, was going on in his day too. And here is he speaking about regulation. And I quote, "The proposal of any new law or regulation of commerce which comes from this order of people, that is, from governments, from people, cronies and so forth, ought always to be listened to with great precaution, and ought never to be adopted till after having been long and carefully examined, not only with the most scrupulous, but with the most suspicious attention. It comes from an order of men whose interest is never exactly the same as that of the public, who have generally an interest to deceive and even oppress the public, and who accordingly have, upon many occasions, both deceived and oppressed it." I think that couldn't have been more neatly put. That is what we are facing with today. Wealth, then, in a free market is generally generated also because, and here's an interesting point, the playing fields that we hear so much about are not equal. I have an advantage because my farm is very good for cows. You have an advantage because your farm is very good for wheat, whereas mine isn't. That's how trade and wealth can be generated, because we swap our respective things. However, if you level the market out so that your field doesn't produce such good corn and my field can't produce such good animals in order to make it fair, neither of us are going to be better off. We're going to be worse off as a consequence. In other words, a level playing field, which is what the single market so lovingly likes to talk about, doesn't help. It actually reduces wealth. Level playing fields are bad for businesses operating in a free market, but they are good for the big corporates and statist monopolies operating in a customs union. Now that is what, of course, the European Union is. Europe, as opposed to the UK, has never understood Adam Smith. This is partly because Europe, to be fair, has spent a lot of its history ruled by autocrats and tyrants. The state is all, the individual is nothing. Statism is the general concept on not all, but quite a lot of continental Europe. The huge corporate businesses are almost by default, therefore, sclerotic, that means their arteries are freezing up, and essentially lazy. They are like and I touch gently here, the revered redwood forests in America that in fact suck the life out of the areas they are growing in. If left to go to fire and burn down, new growth can grow up. But if they're preserved, as they so often are, the result is sterilisation, in effect, of the ground underneath them, except for redwoods. That's, if we like, an illustration of what a lot of corporates are like. These corporates have carved their place in the sun. The boards and their shareholders sit back to enjoy their income. Jesus had a little parable about that, about the man who built bigger barns to put his wealth in, to sit back and say, I can live at my ease. And there's the wonderful line, thou fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Well, maybe they should read that. They don't often. What is happening to the big corporates is that they are essentially becoming rent seekers. In a free market, such dinosaur organisations would have rings run round them by innovative new enterprises and soon be put out of business. However, regulation of the Adam Smith type that he talked about makes it very hard for new enterprises to get off the ground, certainly in the European Union. You have to have an army of lawyers to explain to you the thousands and thousands of pages of regulation that are going to affect your new business. However, regulation of that sort is easy for the corporates. They'll have whole batteries of these people doing it all for them automatically, generating all the right paperwork. It's no problem for them. And in fact, they are often the origin of these regulations. There is a very cosy relationship between the corporates and Brussels, who they want to preserve their monopolies or ineffective monopolies, so they ensure a regulation goes out to make life very difficult for anyone to compete with these big monsters. That's the problem with this kind of so-called level playing field, so-called single market, which is not a free market at all. The trouble is, of course, such arrangements for the corporates will work for a time. But overall, what is obvious, I think, to most of us, tragically, is that the European Union as a whole has become steadily poorer as a result of this. Remember my rather simplistic picture. If we regulate that somebody's cornfield can't grow such good corn, and my fields for cows can't produce such good milk, neither of us are better off, even though it may be, inverted commas, fairer. In fact, of course, world tariff barriers, for good or ill, have in fact been eroding and getting smaller. So the tariff barriers that the European Union put around itself to keep out imported goods, because of course importing goods does to some degree take capital out of an area. If you import far more than you export, then you're going to be in economic trouble to some degree. But because the tariffs have come down, it has been not possible to prevent an awful lot of stuff coming in from outside the European Union, despite efforts to stop it. Goods from China and from India and so on are pouring in, partly because they are cheaper, and also, in fact, because they're sometimes better, let us be honest. They're better made, because people work hard there. That's a bit of a slur, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that too widely. But you know, that issue lurks. So, the European Union, and here I come on to a more focused point, the European Union devised a cunning plan to try and deal with this importing of goods from the BRICS, or whatever you like to label them. And to my mind, this is the answer to the strange problem as to why the European Union has embraced the idea of catastrophic anthropogenic global warming. This is the tool, the moral imperative, as they could see it, for saving the planet from the dire consequences of burning fossil fuels. And the EU hoped it could hobble the burgeoning countries like China and India and even Russia and South Africa by making energy extremely expensive, forcing particularly developing countries to use so-called renewable energies instead of using coal or oil or whatever they may have to hand, which would be much cheaper and much more reliable. But by doing that, they saw themselves as being able to crush the competition that the EU was facing, as it saw, to its detriment. However, as so often happens when you have a cunning plan, it also turned out, to use an anglicised expression, forgive those who are from other countries, a heffalump trap. Those of us who know anything about Winnie the Pooh remember that Pooh dug a heffalump trap to catch a heffalump and fell into it himself. Traditional problem when you make a cunning plan. So, this bid to save the corporates and the EU from economic disaster, I'm racing on, I will get there, led to this extraordinary obsession with climate change, which, for other reasons I can talk to you later, is nothing to worry about. Just going to finish with, I hope, something encouraging for us all. Most of you know the story of Goliath and David. Yep. David, King David, well, he wasn't King David then, he's a young lad. This great giant of a so-called warrior was going to challenge the armies of Israel, and everyone was terrified of him. He was 9 foot tall, he was huge. Nobody wanted to fight him. But David said, don't worry, I can. And as you know, what happened was, he goes out to meet the warrior. What does he use? He uses his sling. Now, everybody would have thought, he's mad. Little lad with a sling, no armour, how's he going to win? Well, the answer is he had the advantage all along. That man, that big monster of a man, was a dead man walking. He had acromegaly, a disease whereby the growth hormones have made him get bigger and bigger, it produces more bones than you need. He was a cripple. That's why he had an armour bearer who had to lead him forward. He was probably half blind. He demanded David should come to him. Well, why the heck should he? So David just went straight through the forehead and killed him dead. A slingshot, by the way, in those days was probably as good as a Colt 45. So he had the advantage. This guy was sick and dying. So is the European Union. We don't need big armies in that sense to deal with the European Union. This European Union is that Goliath. If we think of it the wrong way, like King Saul, we'd be frightened of it. But if you think of it from David's point of view, one slingshot, that guy, the European Union is overgrown, it is overweening, it is overbalanced, and it is diseased. I think, hopefully, we can win.